Hi everyone. My name is Zizi Boa Papachikepo Zizi. Thank you for joining us in this session. Just two reminders. When we're done, please take the time to fill in these two posters. What needs to be done to realize a feminist economy, and what does a capitalistic feminist economy look like? And after the session, we have a 30-minute break, which will be followed by a social. I know it's been a long day, we've been here the whole day, but we'd really love it if you joined us. We've got some great artists lined up. So now I'll be handing over to Kwezi, Aria, and Teresa. We're talking about rethinking power politics in economics. Please give them a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by taking you to a sensorial experience.
Realmente, o negócio pode ir abaixo. Eu, como casal, ambulante com a minha cara. Mas depois no banco, cada um fecha o tempo. Não dá nada bancada. Hoje não, no meio passar para allá. É boa, até principalmente para o Estado, né? Porque tipo, a Juliana vamos lá dizer obrigada a pagar uma quantia, mas em contrapartida dessa quantia depois volta, né? Tipo, te dá segurança. Mas não sei porque que o nosso Estado também não faz isso. Para si acha que não faz por quê? Por exemplo, falta de organização. A coisa para fazer com nós. Ele é novo, cada brasileiro com a sua opinião.
Right. Good afternoon again. My name is Aurea Mozinho, and I'm here to talk to you today about challenges of the global order contextualized to Africa, power and economic rights. And I'll be particularly talking about informal street vendors, hawkers in Luanda, which is the capital of Angola, where I'm from. What you just heard is an excerpt, pardon my English, it's not my first language, which also serves to sort of change things up a bit in the space, right? What you heard is an excerpt of an interview conducted by a colleague of mine, a comrade, with an informal street vendor in Luanda, in Portuguese. But really what made me bring this interview today wasn't necessarily the material, because I knew most of you wouldn't understand, but the background noise. The background noise is the streets in Luanda. It is, as you could hear, a lot of women, a lot of cars driving about, a lot of women shouting, they're selling goods. If any of you have been to Luanda, you would have noticed that there are women walking around all over the city selling things on their back, on their heads, like the woman in the picture. So my starting point of question is, what if our economies looked like that? And I ask, what if our economies look like that? Because currently, we consider this activity as the informal sector, we consider it as separate, we consider it as undesirable. And our idea of the economy is this organized, formal relationship between employer and employee in a workplace, preferably some concrete structure that involves people not necessarily wearing suits, sometimes they wear khaki shorts, but it's sanitized, it's clean, and it's not in the street. It's not done by women with babies on the back. It's not done in an unregulated way. It's done. You understand what I see, right? So, on my presentation today, I wanted to talk about informal street vendors, because that's the reality of powerlessness in terms of economic justice that are no best. I was born and bred in Luanda. I lived in South Africa for some years, and I'm back living in Luanda. And every day, as you walk or drive in the cities, that's the experience of the economy that you grapple with. You grapple with informality, you grapple with a growing and a big and a growing number of people in the streets selling goods, changing money, charting goods away, braiding hair, and it's not anywhere inside an establishment. It's outside. It's there for everyone to see. So the particularity and why I think the informal sector is very important is because in contexts like Angola, it actually represents the sector that employs the majority of the people, and mostly women in this sector. And I'll say employ in way of resisting the narrative that say the people that are not in the informal sector are not employed. Yes, they seek for positions that are more formalized. Yes, they seek for more job security, but that's not inherently connected to the activity they're carrying out, but more about the conditions in which that activity is carried out. So we call the informal street vendors zungeiras, which means the one that hawks in Kimbundu, which is one of our national language. And they sell everything. You can buy live chickens, you can buy dogs, you can buy canned food, you can buy clothes, you can buy there's virtually a few category of products that you won't find for sale in the streets of Luanda. And I know this is a reality that many of you, even in Johannesburg and throughout the continent, will be familiar with. In the continent, in Angola, there hasn't really been a significant effort to measure the informal sector or to understand it. The International Labour Organization estimates that the average size of it in the continent is about 41% of GDP, the gross domestic product, with all the caveats that GDP represents. But here is just a benchmark for us understanding what this means. And in some contexts, for example, in Nigeria and Tanzania, it is as much as 60% of GDP. There isn't any number for Angola, but I assume it's closer to Nigeria and Tanzania, and probably more now that we're going through an economic crisis that literally cars are competing with people in the streets. But we must understand the value of the informal sector outside of its economic contribution. And I make two contentions, that it represents both subsistence but also resistance. And it represents subsistence because it is a large number of families that have, of women particularly, that have in the informal activity and informal street vending, that have it as the main economic activity. Many of these women are primary providers for their family. Many are the sole providers for their family. And actually, with the economic crisis that we're facing in Angola now, a lot of women are actually going, and increasingly younger women, having their first job as informal street vendors. They go into the informal sector as their first job. So if you do a class analysis in Angola, most people that are not in the middle class are in the informal sector or know someone that is in the informal sector, or even if they consider themselves unemployed, they're depending on someone that has income coming from the informal sector. So from the interviews that my colleague and I conducted, we found out that many women are actually mothers to adult children, adults, my age probably, and because this sons and daughters can't find employment, they actually they sustain them in the house. So it is a key factor. I have 2 minutes. Do you think it's fair?
No. Give her more.
I'll exercise fairness. So the informal sector in Angola, and I'm talking about the Angolan reality, and I'm sure you can have more contributions. And in the Angolan context, at least, it represents, as I say, I think, a subsistence to the state, because we don't have any kind of social provisioning. So poor people that should depend on state for basic services like health and education, and social welfare, are actually using the informal sector as a way of subsistence. But it's also this informal sector that is mostly attacked in terms of policies, but it's in terms of actions of the state. The dynamics and the power dynamics, particularly between the state and the informal street vendors, and when I say that, I mean women. I don't want to say Zungeras all the time, so not to create a break in the language. The power dynamics between the state and the informal street vendors is marked by institutional violence, and this violence is legitimizing antagonistic policies and discourse that delegitimizes the informal sector, considering it to be underdeveloped, not modern, and in line with this very Western or Lusotropical in the case of Angola idea of what a city should look like, of what an economy should look like. Every now and then, politicians make announcements about cleaning up the city, about fighting the informal sector. And that's where I see the resistance happening. And the resistance happens particularly because of what the informal sector represents and what women in the informal sector represent. First, they represent a challenge against this notion that what the economy should look like. They are a legitimate sector of economic activity. And here I want to say that I'm not glamorizing the informal street the sector. I think people should have more provisions for safety and for better work conditions. And there's also a challenge in the sense of the occupation of the place the female body has in occupying the city. So it's women and feminized bodies that are out there selling products. So I think in a context of a patriarchal economy, that is also challenging the way we think about the economy. And also it's a challenge of the way we think economic activity should be organized. As I said in the beginning, we very much think about, in terms, even in the socialist circles, in terms of an employee and employer relationship, but the informal sector or the activity in the formal sector shows us autonomous economic activity that responds to reality, that is not dictated by government or corporations, and more important, collective ways of organizing. Because even though women have their business individually, they rely on each other for social provisioning. For example, one of the things that they do is income pooling, that in South Africa you call stokvel, we call kishikila. So the income pool in case of funerals, the income pool in case of happy celebrations, the income pool when they harassed by the administrative officials to get the business back. So all of these ways, all of these things, I think, are ways in which women in the informal sector are challenging the traditional notion and power relations that are involved in the economy. And I think those are some of the reasons why the informal sector is so much stigmatized. To finalize this report. So what are some of the key ideas that I think we should take from here, and what are we looking at in terms of women in the informal sector? A political economist, Fantu Sherry, said, a closer look at the informal sector in Africa provides a glimpse of what could be achieved if Africa's economies and financial policies were more attuned to the continent's everyday realities. So I start with the sound because I want to challenge us with the notion of what an economy should look like. And I want to challenge the idea that African economies will automatically or should look like factories necessarily, should look like people employed in companies, or should look like, I don't know, anything that is not in the street, that is not noisy, that is not loud, that is bland. I think our streets have a lot of character, and I think that is part of us as a people, with all of our diversities throughout the continent. And why shouldn't the economy or our economy should look like that? So in terms of frameworks for where we are going within the informal sector, there's this, what I think, somewhat revolutionary document that sometimes we fall short in the implementation, which is the Maputo Protocol. And the Maputo Protocol says two things in Article 13 about economic and social welfare rights. In line E, it says that member states should create conditions to promote and support the occupations and economic activities of women, in particular in the informal sector, and also they should establish a system of protection and social insurance for women working in the informal sector and sensitize them to adhere it. I like these two policies because it sort of goes counter to the narrative that many African states have of the informal sector as the enemy. It's justified generally by the fact that they don't pay taxes, which is a lie, as some of you may be familiar with the literature. Taxes is not only what you pay directly, there's implicit taxes in the informal sector, mostly through VAT, pays a lot of, contributes a lot to the fiscus, so that must be taken into account. And it gives us some sort of an idea of what we should strive in terms of how we treat the informal sector. And then maybe, and for this room particularly, start challenging, as our sister Lebohang said this morning, the idea of considering the informal sector. Why? Because it automatically separates, delegitimize. What about calling it, since it's actually the majority, the sector that holds the majority of the economic activity, what about calling it the economy? Shouldn't it be the parallel economy, the one that employs the least? So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me? What are you doing here, Matt? It's not an open invitation. So I think firstly, I really want to thank the labor that went into the organizing of the space, particularly some of the detail throughout this entire festival. I think as we rethink and reimagine what just economies look like, the work of cultural production, the work of kind of love and care should form the basis of our rethinking. So it's no accident that we have fantastic art in the room, we have fresh flowers, and it changes the space significantly. It feels less like my lecture room at the place that's named after Cecil John Rhodes, which I am very thankful for. Because that place had, there's this one room, I think Ulisha knows it, she's still here? No, she left. There's one room in the law faculty that was just lined with portraits of white men. And apparently that's just like not a problem. Alright, so my name is Kwezi. And I want to think through out loud in no really structured way this idea of rethinking economics and placing women at the center of that and gendered subjects. So I'm going to try and read some stuff so that you guys think I'm prepared. So my work has primarily involved itself with thinking and acting on the nature and textures of violence against women and all gendered subjects. When I talk about gendered subjects, I'm talking about people for whom gender as a signifying category bears negative consequences. That makes sense, right? So this is kind of and answers one of the questions that has come in today. And is like a response to some of the rhetoric we like in this country and across the globe. When we're saying that we're talking about gender, suddenly we want to take out power from an analysis of gender. They're like, no, but men must come too because it's gender. But we're not all gendered as people in the same ways. For some of us, being gendered is a nice thing, like Mark. For some of us, being gendered is a not very nice thing. So just to make that clear. The work is about understanding womanhood and gender in more complicated ways. So again, it's about thinking through, yes, there are multiple forms in which we express and identify, but as a class of people, womanhood, feminized people, people who are thought to be like girls, feeling like girls, or taking the status of girls, have a particular way in which they are treated. So as we're invited then to rethink, I want to go a little bit crazy with that. I want to start first by kind of acknowledging the obvious, because I don't want to fight with it. The obvious for me is to recognize that the normal frameworks of understanding the economy, of building economies, of understanding what an economy is a problem. What is out there for us to even think through what this word is a problem. It doesn't work, and it just reinforces what is wrong with the world, which is about wealth that is created and sits only with the hands of the few, and that wealth has been created by the hands of the majority. So when I want to take the invitation to rethink, I want to extend that invitation to do this within what I want to call thinking or epistemic liberated zones. So placing of thinking and imaginative work that pushes us so far that there's very little room for retribution, for judgment, for calls on selfishness, for calls about impracticality or practicality. That place, I think, is where we'll find answers that start to rebuild. What do I think that these liberated zones can help us to do? They can help us by truly centering women and all gendered subjects. Now, I know that a lot of research, and I'm going to get in trouble here because I'm in a research space, a lot of research thinks that if you go to groups and groups of women, already with preconceived hypotheses, already with language and texture and framing that comes from elsewhere, and just ask people within those frames, you are centering them. And what you are wanting to do is you're asking for their experience. So what is your experience of the macroeconomy? And you explain the macroeconomy in your particular way. That's not centering women in this framework. Because what that does is you're already going in, it's like the work of translation. You're already going in with something. And therefore you give no room to listen to what those people understand to be the building blocks of how we live and how we share the things we have and how we use the things we have. So for me, averting therefore the center of analysis is about placing women and all of these gendered subjects that I speak about as the experts, not only of their own experiences, so we do love to go to black women to ask them about their pain, but also as the experts in explaining that experience and making meaning out of that experience. So not just about collating experiences and therefore kind of aggregating them and calling it theory. And that's my first ask. It's about a true centering of women's experiences, women's lives, particularly black women. When Patricia Hill Collins tries to teach us about this, she tells us that it invites us into new ways of visioning, into new ways of understanding what we even mean by politics, and by that extension, economics. She speaks to new angles of this vision that are not just about, in her work, the African American experience, but are on the basic concepts that are to be used to describe that experience. This, she says, enriches our theoretical understandings. The second thing for me that these zones must and can do is to build wealth. And this is an idea I'm kind of playing around, and you can tell me if it's complete nonsense, which I think it is. But this idea of trying to overemphasize the wealth and the power of what we call feminized economies, what we were talking about in terms of informal economies, I think here about our need to overemphasize the sex trade, the beauty and hair spaces of cultural production, the care economy, and the ways in which we do collective labor. And if we were unable to think through this, I would put a question that says, can we think about conversations, everyone who kind of works in a corporate environment and is like middle class and has a domestic worker, what are the conversations that are bound to happen every Monday after a month ends? Nothing. You're gonna pretend like you don't know that. So,
like complaining, like absenteeism or something like that.
Good thing. Salary.
No, it's not salary. Well, salaries are there. But when I was thinking about this, it's kind of about the role that domestic workers play in our households and what happens when that kind of labor gets removed from the house. So if a worker is unhappy with the treatment, they're most likely going to leave after being paid.
Yeah.
And therefore, on Mondays after payday, you have these millions of young women or younger women who are unable to come into the office, who are unable to function properly because suddenly the childcare, the cleaning work, all of that has been left undone. Now, what does it look like to overemphasize that work in ways that the kind of normative economies don't do? And I want us to meditate upon this and think it through in the same ways that we'll think about the hair industries, the sex trade industries, and the care economies. The second example I wanted to give around the care economies kind of selfishly comes from my own life. So my mother is a retired nurse, and I found it very fascinating because she worked in the community where we are from, right? And it's like a little village town. And the kind of strands to the care work that Mama had to do was so multiple and multifold. So there's the stuff she has to do in our household. And then there's the stuff she's paid to do in the hospital. But in the hospital, because the hospital is steeped within kind of our hometown, everybody who's coming from our villages is somehow related to us. So everyone who walks into that particular hospital, Umama has to give special attention to, because it's a public hospital and they need ways in which to navigate that. So after her 12-hour shift, she's not only having had to take care of patients in the hospital, of us in the home, but also of the patients that come as a result of her womanhood, of her marriage status, of her status in the community. And those layers and layers of work that will only be compensated once is something that for me, I need a feminist economist to think through. The second thing I want to talk about, and I was asked to reflect on from today's proceedings, is apparently we're being asked why we have a feminist economy stream and why we're not just talking about women's things like in the middle of everybody else's things. Why are we so special? Does anyone here have that question? Or brave enough to ask that question? So I guess it's a question of power, right? Because central to our work on justice is about power. And it's about visibilizing particular experiences. And it's about, again, overemphasizing things that get relegated to softer issues, get relegated to girl things, which are the things that collectively form part of the majority of the world's wealth and labor. So all of the bits of work that we want to think through as informal, as on the periphery, as, you know, in the kind of, I've forgotten the word, is what we need to centralize for us to start building new ways of seeing and new ways of knowing. And when we don't have space to do that outside of the kind of mainstream, then we don't have the safety for the kind of imaginative work and thinking work we need to be doing. Have I answered the question of why we have only a feminist only stream? No? What am I looking for now? lastly, I think in trying to situate all of this within a structural analysis, I think it's important to again speak to the fact that what we're engaging in is an interplay of traditional forms of power, such as kind of what we know as global economics and politics, geopolitics and processes, with the politics of the immediate, the intimate, the behavior, the norm, the attitude, from person to person, man to woman to woman, heterosexual to homosexual, and so forth. So our understanding of the economy and of power should always look into this interplay and elevate the forms of power that are exercised in what we think and what we call the domestic sphere. Be it when women and gender non-conforming people are facing the brunt of physical, emotional, sexual, and financial violence in the home, or poverty, together with the models of everyday resistance to these oppressions. So for me, I think as feminists have taught us that the problem with how the economy is organized is a problem of power, is a problem of how power is distributed, of how it's understood. But the solution is also power. It's also about building collective power. It's about seeing the power that lies within the labor of those on the margins. It's about building a consciousness where we know what exactly would happen if all the domestic workers after this 25th of this month stayed at home. And what exactly would happen to the global economy. And that for me is the work. And the work is about trying to experiment with what feels like these crazy ideas and see exactly what the ripple effects are. Because now we kind of still just theorize about it. What would happen if we withdrew our labor? What would be this? And if we just did, then in very practical and real ways, then the kind of might of the gendered subjects of the world would be shown, and we would be forced to reimagine ways that are more inclusive, that do overemphasize what actually is the economic activity that keeps the world running. And I think that's what I want to end off, because everybody's face looks like.
So I think Kwesi's kind of introduced my talk to some extent in a very powerful way. Thank you, Kwesi. So just a brief background on me. I'm an architect and I run a company that engages the domestic worker sector. So I'm really glad that she started to provoke that question already around their inherent value and how they're inherently quite devalued in our society. So my talk is around the value construct, and so I'm just going to read a little bit about what I wrote. So there's the idiomatic expression, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," and that refers to a seemingly avoidable error where something good is eliminated when trying to get rid of something bad, or in other words, rejecting the favorable along with the unfavorable. We often hear the expression used when countering radical abandonment or rejection of existing systems or structures that are proven to have greatly negative impacts on large groups of society. The sentiment implies that those systems being challenged cannot be all bad and they have learnings that can be drawn from them. While I can appreciate the argument, I engage it also through an alternative publication, one that was introduced by Slovenian political and cultural philosopher Slavoj Žižek in his book, The Universal Exception. And he suggests that we rather throw out the baby and keep the bathwater. So this is to say that rather than to keep what we've come to understand as good economic structures, for instance, we rather look at what we've termed failure or disruptions within it, because those things stand to show us the true nature of its design, while to focus on the baby would simply reinforce our manipulated sense of value and quickly have us reverting back to inherited definitions of good and bad, worthy and worthless, value and valueless, based more on form rather than on content. So let me define my bathwater. My bathwater is the domestic worker sector, and not just or rather not the domestic worker sector, but the women within it. And often in conversations around economic reform and transformation, the baby is what good can be salvaged of existing economic systems so that they can be used foundationally in the pursuit of a rehabilitated economy. This often has us overlooking the casualties in the bathwater who often live out some of the solutions that we search for in elite spaces such as these. Domestic workers remain some of our most marginalized and exploited demographics, with the sector having seen very little systematic change post-democracy. Can you hear me now?
We've been hearing you.
Okay. So there have been some wins, progress around establishing more extensive rights and policies, clearer employee-employee terms and contracts, union presence and strength, research support, and the like. But what's remained almost impossible to affect is their level of exposure to various forms of psychological violence, including racism, sexism, infantilization, sexualization, objectification, degradation, and varying other scales and forms of indignity. The UK economist and academic Ellis Lawler provoked the thought that societies would collapse if cleaners stopped working, as almost everything hinges on cleanliness. Let me reiterate that every single industry and facet of society needs cleanliness, hence cleaners. Lawler claims that cleaners are around 9 times more valuable to society than bankers, while they're valued at 11 times less than them. They are one of the largest influences on household spend, only second to the leading females in a home. And if they stop working, would greatly affect many women's choice to work or to stay at home and tend to their children in their households. And our female workforce contributes 44% to our GDP. Their work has increased our overall life expectancy and mental health. They're directly involved in our society's early childhood development and the overall raising of our society's children of various classes, races, and religions. They directly affect our safety through their intimate and constant presence within our homes while we're not there. They sustain our ever-increasing female workforce. The list goes on, but fundamentally, they contribute greatly to sustaining our country's rhythm of productivity, and they aid in upholding our perceived level of success as a society, as that success visually hinges on our level of cleanliness. And a lack of cleanliness even has come to have a direct correlation to an increase in dissent, and it's become associated to seemingly uncaring and even corrupt governments. So due to the sector's precarious design blueprint and placement within society, it's become an intensely paradoxical and confused territory, rendering the perceived value of the woman within the sector equally as confused. So some of these paradoxes that they sit in include the fact that they're clean for a living, but they're often suspected of having bad hygiene and carrying diseases. They're trusted with the most intimate parts of our lives, but they're also the first to be suspected when something goes missing. Although associated to cleanliness, which as I mentioned is one of the perceptive measures of the success of a society, they remain one of the industries with the least access to opportunities and the ability to experience personal success within the formal economy. They're exposed to excessive household and industry waste while they are in positions of need. They're in very close proximity to and granted access to historically white resources and amenities such as universities and private hospitals, but they remain unable to benefit from those resources that they're very close to. They're expected to play a mothering role while they're often infantilized. Their roles both deeply personal and professional, and that blurs the line between what's acceptable of the employer-employee relationship. There's an incredibly extensive list I want to get through because you're running out of time. But again, these are simply a few examples of the value that they bring. So even if we took these values outlined and we tested them against existing male-centric measures and definitions of value, they should be more valuable than they currently are. Even if you were to value their innovation capacity as they innovate household brand products every day on a regular basis, and their ability to save us time, which is also, again, based on these male-centric measures, should be valued at much higher cost than they currently are. Strategists as well, as they're very good at
helping families to save money through groceries and shopping around, those sorts of things. So even if we were to not talk about the more female-centric, historically female-centric values of care work and emotional labor, and were to value them simply at male-centric measures, they should be valued at much higher rates than they currently are. And in my process of shifting that relationship, some of the responses I've had thus far from corporate environments are things like, wow, what a good cause, you're a Mother Teresa, and ultimately reducing these things to charity work. So these and such statements continue to reinforce a presence for them that implies that they cannot engage with the economy on value-based terms, but rather on charitable terms as perpetual dependents. And this type of language has and continues to exclude them from participating in and engaging the economy in ways that can redefine and shift our perception of value and the way that money flows towards these definitions of value. And so, really in closing, I just want to say, don't throw out the bathwater.
Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor for the next 10 minutes. And then after we've taken all your questions, the speakers are going to answer for another 10 minutes. I know I'm eating into a break, but definitely it'll be worth it. And remember, after the break, we're doing the cocktail thing, right? So, questions?
I don't have a question as much, but I just wanted to say, like, I am amazed and privileged as a male to be actually surrounded by such powerful conversations and women, at the forefront. Because I always imagined this space, but I never thought, I could be in that space. And seeing an imagination becoming a reality is really amazing. I just want to say more about it.
Thank you, and thank you to the labor of love that created this stream. We all really appreciate it, and I think we've benefited from the discussions we've had today. Yes.
Hello. I came in a bit late to the session, but the last bit that I caught was really powerful. And from what I'm getting, it's like it's still maybe still a theorizing stage, but I wanted to know if any of the speakers who were discussing have started thinking about feminist economists organizing around some of the topics that they're talking about. Because I think a major thing that you brought out is that it's less about what would happen if, it's more about one of the ways to really show the value and impact of women, particularly in care labor, is that we start organizing, they don't show up to work the next morning, and then the economy is forced to reckon with that.
Quick question to the room. Is it better if question, answer, or question, then answer?
Okay, so I was raised by a single mom, so I've always known that women are powerful because the woman who raised me was also powerful in a sense. My question goes into terms of the informal economy. Firstly, how do we ensure long-term sustainability of the work that the women that are doing in the streets? Because I'm from Zimbabwe, and a lot of the time you find, so I was relating a lot to what you were saying. In the capital, you find that there's a lot of vendors in the streets selling tomatoes, selling all sorts of things, right? But they're always at the risk of one, getting the stuff attached by the police or the type of police that deals with all of the stuff. So how can we then take the power back or ensure long-term sustainability of this type of economy, at the same time making sure that we improve the lives of these people that are working so hard? Because you find a lot of the time there's so much competition that one vendor is next to the other, and it's a whole street of vendors, and each one is competing maybe for even $3 a day just for money to get food for that day. How can we then sort of improve that economy at the same time improving the lives of our people working in that sector.
Okay, so starting there, and then we're going to go to later.
Thank you for an incredible panel. This question actually came from something Kwesi said, but I think it applies to both of your cases, so I'm going to throw it out. You know, in both cases, you've spoken about forms of resistance, particularly in the case of Angola. So, the different ways, the challenging power and challenging the dominant economy. And then we spoke about building collective action and going on strike, but there's this thing I'm trying to reconcile in my head, which is the kind of everyday forms of resistance, and then how that actually builds in a way that's capable of really seizing power. And we've been to other presentations where you really see the degree of economic power, of capital. So how do you hold, is there a space, I mean, the question, but is there a space for holding capital accountable in these forms of everyday resistance?
No, you.
So thank you so much for the panel. I think it was really interesting. From I think what the speaker was saying, got me thinking a lot also about the relationship that Black women have with the city space, and how we constantly occupy two very different things, right? Of complete visibility and complete invisibility, especially in the city space, and especially with when you're a domestic worker or just a Black woman in a city or in a suburb, people think of you in that space as there for the consumption of white people. So it's that thing of as a Black woman not being seen completely, or being overly seen, and the violence that comes with that.
Thanks so much for a very interesting presentation. Yeah, the issues are really at the core of my heart, because I've done some research around the economy, domestic work, and I'm glad that at least the speakers managed to stitch together the connections that are actually related to the vulnerability of the sectors and how women's work is actually undervalued in those particular sectors. But also thinking of the thought-provoking question or maybe scenario that was actually posed by Kwesi around perhaps what would happen when one day domestic workers just decide to withdraw their labor power. Not only domestic workers, but all caregivers, like even in the case of mothers. And how then do we build on such kind of perhaps resistance strategies to build a strong movement for particularly people like vulnerable workers like domestic workers who are actually deprived of the right perhaps to labor rights in the while they are behind closed doors, the private spaces where they work. And at the same time there is this kind of paternalistic relationships within those particular spaces. And I think there was a question that was raised around perhaps how do we, it was actually directed to the capitalists, how do we, I don't think it was the openness, but I would like to say how then we also bring the state, the government into this entire matrix to ensure that all these calls around, I think the government really knows what's going on in these particular vulnerable sectors, and all they can do is to really embrace some kind of responses that are not sustainable, how then do we ensure that in the end we have sustainable kind of responses to whatever actions that we expect from these particular vulnerable sectors? Because we also have to understand that it's not, yes, they have their agents, we're not going to try and say they don't have agents, but it's actually somehow treated because of how the work is actually undervalued.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for your presentations. I just have a couple of questions, and I'm just going to ask them, some of which I might have the answers to, but some of which I don't. But I'm opening myself up and everyone else that is in here into the process of rethinking, right? So we have this information, we have this knowledge, right? We have this knowing, right? Is there a feminist movement that exists somewhere through which we can entrust with this information and trust them to take it forward? Do domestic workers, are domestic workers part of a trade union that really speaks to the work that they do and that protects their interests? Are women that are part of informal, the informal trade, that are vendors in the street, are they part of a collective that protects their interests and understands their vulnerabilities as women? If those spaces do not exist, are there people in this room that do that work? Are there people in this room that would be interested in doing such a job? Or are we comfortable to have these discussions and then to continue and wait for the next 2019 Rethinking Economics Festival? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any more hands?
Yeah. So I just wanted to add to that, is there also a platform to actually invite the women themselves into the space and change the dynamics of language? Because we're always talking academia, but most of the time it's good, you write a paper, you know, I've done research on migrant women and children, but I had to change language as a man going into a female space. So I'm also interested in these discussions. Can we invite women from these different sectors and actually hear what their opinions are about this discussion itself?
Great. Any more hands?
Sorry, I think mine is more of a comment than a question. But I think the panel actually is brilliant. I think I thought of how middle class black women in the informal sector and just the women who live below the poverty line and how intertwined our lives are generally with each other is probably the most I am shaken, because we live in this middle class bubble that everyone aspires to live within. So we are working in corporate spaces and we're making money and we drive these cars. And people aspire to be within that space, right? But everything is so interconnected to each other, because if my domestic worker decides actually you're not paying me enough and I won't come in on the Monday, I can't go to work, and which helps my livelihood, you know. For example, I work in the CBD most of the time, and there are women who sell veggies. I stopped buying veggies at fruit and veggies because they're expensive. So my thought is, if they for some reason decide actually you're not worth our time, these are too affordable and we're not making enough money, I actually can't afford to buy veggies anymore, and I have to go back to paying exorbitant prices for vegetables. So our lives are so intertwined to each other, and this plays into power dynamics, because this is essentially how patriarchy and capitalism works, because we think we're so different, but if we're separated from each other, none of us are actually going to survive within this economic environment that we have. But I think I do have a question about how do we fit this informal sector into this mainstream economic theory, into this or developing or designing a feminist theory that is able to fit in informal sectors in the African perspective, in the South African perspective, or, what is the thinking behind that?
Awesome. So I'm closing the floor. And I'll actually jump in to give you guys some reprieve. I think your question around is there somebody in the room doing work around creating cooperatives, getting these people to organize? I work in something like that, right? The problem is, and it speaks to what you said, is that it's I work for a strategy consulting firm, so we walk into the boardroom, do an issue tree. This is how we're going to strengthen value chains for subsistence farming in East Africa. That's not human-centered design. You need to actually bring those people into that process. I'm thinking, I'm going in. That's the limitations of the work that is being done in trying to do these cooperatives, is that these elitist, middle class and above people are designing the strategies without the input of the people who will be using the strategies. And as Kwezi said, people have to live out these solutions that were created for them, right? And I think just as a thought moving forward in terms of taking up this kind of work, take a step back, don't center yourself in it. Whether you have your BCom economics or whatever, you facilitate the process. It must be a human-centered design, because we can all sit here and theorize how we can strengthen that. And we get there, we try to implement, and it doesn't work because we don't have that lived experience, right? So when we're thinking about creating these cooperatives, this unionizing and everything, it's not our thing to create. It's our thing to support. We should the power should be in the hands of the people who are going to be using it. Great example, Slum Dwellers International. Slum Dwellers came together and they created an organization for themselves. It works because they created it as slum dwellers for themselves, right? So, to the presenters, time to answer questions.
No, it's fine. I didn't even. Oh God. Your questions are. I'm going to pretend to answer your questions and not answer them because they're difficult. I think one of the biggest lies of how a neoliberal economy gets designed is the very individualistic and essentialist approaches. So, without kind of not thinking through privilege and power, one of my answers to the questions of have we invited, we are those women, right? In many ways, the women who are in the room. If the women who filled up this room, who do any kind, all of us are doing some kind of economic or any other labor. If all of us who filled up the room tomorrow decided not to wake up, don't feed the child, don't have sex with the person, don't clean the house, if just that small experiment, don't do nothing, eat, go to the loo, eat some more. Something would shake. But the lie, of course, of kind of power structures and capitalism is this idea of there should always be another thing, yeah? The thing that stops us from acting all the time. Not everyone is here. We are in Braamfontein. What about the women in Butterworth? In Butterworth, but what about the ones in Mkanduli? But what about the ones at Kolin? And that's not without saying we must all go together, but we must notice some of the ways in which we get demobilized by a need to tick all of the boxes that we didn't even make ourselves. So to link up to your point again of how so intricately involved, particularly as Black women, only because I'm a Black woman, our lives are across class. That for me is something that we haven't really explored the power of. I'll use an anecdote again. I've sat, for example, in my village home many Christmases and wondered what would happen if none of us decided to do the Christmas lunch thing. And what are the ways in which patriarchy has designed this conflict between, the supposed conflict between my grandmother to my mother, to my dad's sister, and what that conflict gives way, what it gives way to. So that thing of all these women hate each other keeps everyone in their little corner, laboring for capitalism. But if on that 25th of 2019 they all slept, the person who wouldn't have their best Christmas is the man of the house. So those things for me is like the waking up we need to do with each other. That says, in my realm of influence, in my realm of power, how am I overemphasizing my own labor power that I'm giving away for free on a daily basis? And that again links to the question of, is there resistance? I think individual acts of resistance are like, they're every day, right? There are all kinds of strikes that don't even get framed as strikes. There's all kinds of ways in which people do resist. What I do think we need to build better on, Nico, is about building this collective power. I think spaces exist, I think spaces are there, but I also don't think there's more than enough. I think we need to continue to sit together and reimagine what is our collective power and how are we going to use it. So for example, what would happen if we chose a when I'm called to imagine, I imagine. So if we choose a thing, and then we say, all black women in this country, let us set up a resistance fund. And we haven't done that. Let's set up our resistance fund, our buffer, for when we throw out the baby. We have the million, because we give the millions to fruit and veg anyway. Yes. With our millions, then we can afford to experiment and play around with these things that won't take people away from actual food. But we haven't thought about our wealth in those ways. We think about our poverty in very individualized spaces and middle class people. But what are all our 50 rands here capable of doing, and not your individual 50 rands? So I'm there. I'm completely there. What is the question? Yeah, discussion of the women themselves. I mean, yeah. All of us were the women themselves. And when I was talking about kind of centering experience in ways that are actually authentic, it's about saying, when I'm thinking about land, women's land rights, as is currently topical in South Africa, I start from where I am, and I trust in the power of my people. So I don't have to think for other women. I can organize with other women. But my issues around urban land and rental and like the city structures need to be brought into the conversation. So this idea that we must forever go and find people and take them to places demobilizes in ways that are not very useful. I saw something a couple of years ago. I have no idea if it was true or if it was a novel or whatever. So someone can tell me. And this is about, it was prompted by this question of visibility, where someone was saying how some of the people who get away with the most murders in cities are the women who sweep at night on the streets, or that could get away with like real life murder, because they're not seen by like capital. So maybe when we're plotting our we may want to think about how that hyper invisibility could be a political tactic, right? Like, who's gonna think to go and ask them who killed so and so as we're busy sweeping our streets?
speak to that a bit, there is the kind of part truth that is also kind of secret, that the ANC targeted domestic workers when it came to wanting to infiltrate very important and key apartheid people in terms of finding out secrets and even potentially considering poisoning. So, yeah, I mean, that power is definitely so I might not have written the questions too coherently, so if I answer really randomly, excuse me. So what organizing is happening? I've found so far in my engagements that there's too many organizing happening and very little that actually meet. And then it starts becoming territorial as well, and it kind of starts to become the system that it built itself to work against. And so to the one lady's point about holding capital accountable, I think a lot of the times when we design something to reactive in a sense, right? That we're reacting to something that exists against us. Because that's the foundation, it tends to then speak to it, right? It's relational, and when it's relational, often we tend to become it because it's an incredibly powerful force. And that's why I think the ideas of isolation, as we reference ourselves truly, as we don't engage each other on these terms, is incredibly important. But I think for the moment, a lot of the things that exist have developed themselves from the foundation that it is reacting to, and so it's as long as it is reactive and as long as it's relative, it tends to mutate into it. And so for me, that's really been my focus, is to acknowledge that it's there, but then to explore the value that exists within the domestic worker sector. So not just extending it beyond what we see as value and what has been valued, even though valued low, so care work. But things again like household brand innovation and how that's an existing value that doesn't even get engaged as value. Or their ability to see, us in incredibly intimate ways, and one could argue that there are best social commentators, right, and the ones who are able to show us as a society where best we are, and yet that's not there. So there's a lot of existing value that's there that doesn't even get termed value and doesn't get engaged as value. And so what my firm does is to try and build relationships with different industries to turn those things into valuable economies. But again, there's a lot of organizations that do a lot of different things, and I think maybe based on your certain skill sets or your interests, you can engage with some of those things. But I think you'll very easily and quickly find the flaws and just the murkiness that comes with engaging in reactive type constructs. City space, so black women, I mean, for me it's a very important topic because as an architect, I love the fact that the informal economy teaches us how to use the city, and how it teaches us how to predict urban growth. It allows us to understand dynamism of urbanity a lot more than the formal economy ever has and ever will. And again, value, but it's not necessarily termed value, it's rather seen as something disruptive and dirty, and then we have things like Project Clean Sweep because it is perceived as dirt and something that must be removed. So, but what I also struggle with is that in academia there is an understanding that is valuable. But for me, my struggle is when the academics engage with it, and it gives them access to further privileges like PhDs, scholarships, accreditation, or further credits and those sorts of things. And again, the threat that lies with the informal economy remains as it is, and we stand to benefit again in these privileged environments. We stand to benefit more and more because we turn these things into PhDs, and we don't necessarily give much back to those environments. So yes, there is a level of understanding that there is something incredibly valuable in what the informal sector does to urbanity, but whether it translates into affecting those economies in positive ways, for me, is certainly not there yet. There are feminist movements that exist. Yeah, so I think I kind of started with your question. Changing the language and creating platforms where we invite the women, absolutely, that's incredibly pivotal, and this is why I call this an elitist space, because that is what it is. The way that I speak, the terms that I'm using, all of these things. And in my work, it's been incredibly important for me to not design on my own and to not design in isolation, but I've also come to realize how far I can go in spaces that completely devalue these women. And so for me, it's constantly been a negotiation to let these women in the room, using the kind of things that I can bring along with my profile of being educated as it's currently valued in this kind of economic system, those sorts of things, and I agree with Kwesi about not speaking on behalf of, and to rather allow people to speak on behalf of themselves and to really provide a platform where they can articulate those things themselves in their own words, with their own thinking. And again, it's around the question of how much do you engage with the existing, or how quickly do you throw the baby out. And for me, in my practice, it's been a constant negotiation between that completely radical throw it out and also it's still here, so let's see just how far we can engage it and how much we can get people into the door. And I think that's an economic question, so probably a bit up to you.
Apparently the economist is left. Not to answer the question, but I want to do an exercise, almost like the one I started with. I want everyone to close their eyes, not to fall asleep, but just allow me for 2 seconds. Kwesi, you too. And I want us to imagine what does an economy look like for you? How people relate in your utopia of an economy, of social relations around economic transactions. What does it look like? How are people related to each other? Where are women? Where are you in your gendered, racialized class space? Where is the state? Where is the community? Where is nature? Where are children? Where are men? And when I engage in this exercise, you can open your eyes now. For me, it looks anything but what we have right now. And the reason I start with this exercise is really to frame the question of sustainability within the informal sector. And there's two parts to this question. There's one part of me that feels very strongly that we cannot allow for human dignity in the current system where we are. We can challenge capitalism with daily acts of resistance because that's about the subsistence, right? But I think anything that is long-term, it's only with throwing that baby. Anything that will lead to the outcomes that we want, to the social and economic relations that we want, is in challenging the system in itself. And that's where I believe collective organizing should come. Because if we focus in collective organizing around niches, understanding, for example, domestic work separate from the informal sector, separate from our middle class life. I'm speaking about myself. Our middle class life, separating from mining, separated from the 1%, then we're not really grappling with how the system works as a whole and how the dynamic is actually this dynamic of separation of poverty and richness, of racialized poverty and feminized poverty is actually part of the system. So in rethinking power, economics, and women, I want to challenge ourselves to think of alternatives. And I know that it's daunting, but because one of the things that neoliberalism and mainstream economics has done is to steal from us the capacity of think about alternative economic lives. And imagination is key, and that's why I started with the exercise of asking, what if our economy sounded like that? What if they looked like that? And I'm imagining the informal reconceptualized to be formal, and I'm imagining where provisioning is not only through wages, for example, sustainability, but of course, in the meantime, there's everyday reality, right? We organize, we fight, there's alternatives we strive to, there's utopia we strive to. And I really think that even in these small niches, in the small pockets, there's a lot of things we can learn about alternatives and demonetizing our concept of the economy. For example, if you look in informal, what we call informal spaces, people are surviving with very particular techniques that could actually teach ourselves about the way we rely on each other. For example, social welfare, right, of the community. You don't pay people to take care of your elderly, of your sick. There's cohesion, there's social cohesion, there's trust, there's care, and I don't mean necessarily feminized care or care in the patriarchal way, but I mean care in the way that I'm relating to you as a person. I see you. I need you and you need me. And I know that sounds like a lot. Some people say this Ubuntu nonsense, but it's actually a bit of what I'm talking about. It's reconceptualizing the economy, reconceptualizing how we think about and how we relate to each other. And Kwesi talked in the beginning of the presentation about sharing of power, and I want to challenge us that it's also a lot giving up privilege, because many of us think that we can change the world from our very comfortable position where we are now. And yes, what happened if the domestic worker didn't come to work tomorrow? But what would happen if I actually paid the domestic worker the wage I would want to be paid if I was doing that work? How many of us are willing to do that? What would happen, for example, with regards to the informal sector, and this is an example I'm making out now, so it might come out as nonsense. What would happen if actually, when informal street vendors are being kicked out of the streets, I don't think only about, oh yeah, now I'm gonna be able to pass with my fancy car in a very clean street, but what would happen if I actually centered that experience of not being able to be in the city, or not being able to live in the city? So, in the rethinking, yes, there's sharing of power, but there's also opening up of privilege. And opening up of privilege in economic terms, in terms of space, which spaces we occupy, which spaces we must stop occupying. And I won't bore you with more, but I want to leave with a thought by Amilcar Cabral. He was an anti-colonial freedom fighter from Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, and he talked about a very interesting thing that is called the class suicide. The idea that real change requires some class suicide, some patriarchal suicide. And my interest in the informal sector is both, I think it says a lot of the neglected reality as people. And I think that's why I framed the resistance of the informal sector as a struggle against a system of economic thought, of political thought, that is a hegemonic and imperialistic system. So I think there's a lot that we can learn in terms of struggle, but in the day-to-day, there's also ways that we need to open hand of privilege so we can allow for more dignity. The thing is, I don't know all of the answers, and I think, as my sisters have said before me, collective power, feminist organizing has a huge role to play in that. Thank you.